I was eating a cold ration bar when the signal arrived. Not a distress call, not a navigation update, a mandatory broadcast override. The kind that only 3 entities in the known galaxy could trigger: the Galactic Concord's full council, the Concord's Supreme Chancellor, or a sitting emperor with majority sign-off. The kind of signal that had not fired in over 200 years. My name is Liam Cole. I am 31 years old. I am a deep signal analyst stationed at Relay Node Kappa 7, a communication junction embedded inside a dead asteroid roughly 200,000 kilometers above Vega Prime. On a normal day, my job is to listen, to sort, to log, to send reports that nobody reads, to a department that nobody visits, on a station that most people in the Galactic Concord do not know exists. That day was not a normal day. The broadcast came in at 09:14 station time. My console lit up across every frequency simultaneously. That should not be possible. Signal does not behave that way unless someone with enormous resources forces it to. I dropped the ration bar and pulled up the source identifier. The origin tag was stamped with the seal of the Vathek Empire, the 6-winged crest of the Grand Admiral's office. I felt something cold move through my chest. The Vathek. I had read about them the same way everyone in human space had read about them. In dry, cautious reports written by diplomats who chose their words carefully, because the Vathek had 14,000 warships and a seat at every important table in the Concord. They were insectoid, hive-minded, and ancient. They had been in space for 6,000 years before humanity looked up at the stars. They regarded us the way a person regards a stray animal that has wandered into a clean house, not with hatred exactly, but with a kind of permanent, irritable impatience. The screen in front of me resolved into a face, or what passed for a face. The Vathek Grand Admiral, Vorath Sen, stood against a smooth gray background in full ceremonial plating. He was tall. His carapace was a deep, polished black. His 4 upper limbs were folded in the formal position that Vathek used when delivering official declarations. His voice, when it came, was run through a translation matrix that turned his click-heavy language into flat, precise English. "Citizens of the Galactic Concord," he said, "this broadcast is issued in accordance with Concord Resolution 7714, Emergency Territorial Validation Protocol. The human colony designated Vega Prime has been subject to a closed environmental review. The review, completed under Article 9 of the Concord's Planetary Usage Charter, found that the human presence on this world constitutes an ongoing violation of pre-existing ecological claim filed by the Vathek Empire in the year 3041 of the Standard Galactic Calendar." I stared at the screen. Vega Prime. My screen showed the planet hanging below me through the visual array. A blue and green world, big as a promise. 10.3 billion people. Farmers and engineers and doctors and children in school uniforms and old men growing vegetables in pressurized gardens, and young couples arguing about what to have for dinner. 10.3 billion ordinary human lives stacked up in cities and towns and outpost settlements, spread across 3 continents and 2 ocean platforms. Under this finding, Vorath Sen continued, the Vathek Empire is authorized to initiate reclamation procedures. A response window of 60 seconds is hereby extended to the Human Administrative Authority. Failure to respond will be interpreted as voluntary concession. 60 seconds. I grabbed my comm panel and started sending. Emergency channels. Earth Relay. Vega Prime's planetary government. The Concord's human delegation. Every frequency I had authorization to touch, and 3 I did not. My fingers moved faster than I had ever moved them in my life. I transmitted the broadcast signal, the source identifier, and a single 4-word message: respond now or never. The 60 seconds passed. No response came from Earth. Not because they did not care. Because the notification that should have triggered their emergency protocols, the legal notice that preceded the broadcast, had been buried inside 47 layers of Concord procedural code, routed through 6 administrative sub-offices, and delivered to a committee that met once every 3 galactic months. The window was a formality. It had never been meant to be answered. At 09:15 and 40 seconds, the Vathek fleet uncloaked. I watched it happen on my deep scan array. 400 warships appearing out of nothing above the curve of Vega Prime's atmosphere, their hulls catching the local star's light like a wall of dark mirrors. They moved in absolute formation. No hesitation, no variation. They had been holding position for what my array told me was at least 6 hours, waiting in perfect silence for the moment the Admiral gave the word. The first strike hit the planetary shield grid, then the second. Then they stopped counting in singles and the array started logging impact events by clusters. I could not look away. I know that sounds strange. I know most people, reading this, will wonder why I did not shut off the screen, why I did not curl into the corner of my tiny station and close my eyes and pray. I cannot explain it fully except to say that I am a signal analyst. My entire life has been built around the act of watching, recording, and understanding. Something in me refused to stop doing the only thing I knew how to do. So I watched, and I recorded everything. The broadcast stayed live. Vorath Sen did not leave the frame. He stood and watched his own tactical feed with the calm of a man reviewing a spreadsheet. Around him, off camera, I could hear the clicks and chirps of Vathek officers going about their work. 3 Concord delegate ships held position nearby. I could see their transponder tags on my array. They were watching too. None of them moved to intervene. The hours passed. I recorded the weapons signatures, the frequency cycling of the Vathek orbital cannons, the pattern intervals between barrage waves, the rotation schedule of the fleet's defensive positioning. I recorded it all because it was the only thing I could do, because recording felt like bearing witness, because bearing witness felt like refusing to let them make it nothing. At hour 11, the impacts stopped. Vorath Sen looked into the camera one final time. Ecological remediation of Vega Prime is complete, he said. The Vathek Empire thanks the Galactic Concord for its patience and cooperation. He paused. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, the galaxy is a cleaner place tonight. 3 Concord delegates applauded. The broadcast ended. I sat in the silence of my relay station for 4 minutes. The visual array still showed Vega Prime below me, but the planet looked different now. The lights of the cities that had been visible along the night side were gone. The atmospheric sensors were reading particle levels that meant the air itself was changing. The world was still there, the people were not. 10.3 billion people. I thought about a detail I had logged 3 weeks earlier, a routine data packet from Vega Prime's agricultural network. A farmer named Owen had been complaining in an open community forum that his irrigation system kept misreading soil moisture. He had been arguing with a local technician about it in the kind of cheerful, frustrated way that people argue about small problems when their lives are good. I had logged it without thinking. I had moved on. I thought about Owen. I thought about the technician. I thought about every person like them. Not heroes, not soldiers, just people living their days. And I felt something settle into place inside me. Not grief, not yet. Grief would come later and it would take years. What settled into me then was something harder and quieter. I opened the transmission array and began to build the most important message I had ever sent. I addressed it to Earth Fleet Command, the Concord's human delegation, every human news relay I could reach, and every open channel broadcast frequency in the accessible network. I attached 11 hours of full-quality sensor recordings, every weapons signature, every tactical pattern, every impact event logged to the microsecond, and at the end of the data package, I added 63 words of plain text. I did not write them in anger. I wrote them carefully, the same way I wrote every log report, because careful words last longer than angry ones. The message said, they did this in front of the entire galaxy because they believed we would accept it. They believed we would calculate the odds, see the number of their ships against ours, and decide that survival meant silence. I am transmitting everything I recorded because the first thing we need to do is understand exactly how they did it. Send this to every engineer, every fleet commander, and every analyst you have. I will be in touch. I signed it with my station ID and my name. Then I pushed back from the console, looked out the small viewport at the stars, and started pulling apart my communications array. I had components that most relay stations did not carry: deep-range quantum modulators, signal folding hardware, equipment designed for the kind of long-distance eavesdropping that was technically legal in the Concord's outer zones if you had the right clearance, which I did, because my department was so obscure that no one had ever thought to revoke it. I had spent 11 hours watching how they operated. Now I was going to spend however long it took figuring out how to go back inside. My hands were shaking when I started. By the time I reached the second component panel, They had stopped. The message from Liam Cole reached Earth Fleet Command 42 minutes after transmission. It was marked Priority 1 by the automated system, flagged by 2 duty officers, and placed on Admiral Nina Holt's desk within the hour. Nina read it once. Then she read the attached data, all of it. She was 54 years old. She had spent 30 years in the fleet, most of it in logistics and strategic planning, a career path that people in combat commands sometimes called unglamorous. She had never commanded a ship in active combat. She had, however, spent 3 decades studying every major military engagement in Concorde history, mapping supply lines, modeling fleet behavior, and writing papers on logistical vulnerability that nobody in Earth's government had taken seriously until this moment. She read Liam's data package for 40 minutes without speaking. When she finished, she set the report down on her desk, looked at her communications officer, and said, "Get me every department head, not by message, in person, 20 minutes. The room filled in 18. Nina did not make speeches. She pulled up the tactical data on the room's central display and started talking. She talked about weapons frequency cycling and what it meant for shield countermeasures. She talked about the fleet rotation patterns Liam had logged and where they created blind intervals. She talked about supply infrastructure, the thing that nobody liked to discuss because it was boring and essential, and the single most reliable way to dismantle something large. They have 14,000 ships, she said. We have 220. That gap does not close in a conventional engagement, so we are not going to have a conventional engagement. She paused and let that sit. We are going to have several very specific, very well-timed engagements, and before any of that, we are going to build something we have never built before. Which is? Asked Fleet Engineer Patrick Doyle. A fleet that nobody can see, Nina said. The Articles of Reckoning were signed by every human government, every independent colony authority, and every human crewed station in the known network within 48 hours of the broadcast. The speed of it startled the Concorde's observers. It should not have. Humans had spent 200 years failing to agree on trade routes, tax policy, territorial boundaries, and 100 other things. But every species has a thing that makes them stop arguing and stand together. For humanity, it turned out, the thing was this. The Concorde sent 3 diplomatic envoys to Earth in the first week. Nina had their ships rerouted to a holding position near the debris field that had been Vega Prime's orbital infrastructure, a field of broken metal and dead satellite components that her navigation team had already begun logging and cataloging. The envoys held position there for 6 hours before the Concorde recalled them. Nina never answered their transmissions. She was busy. The engineering teams worked in 3-hour rotations because nobody would agree to sleep for longer than that. Liam's data gave them the Vothek weapons frequency cycling, and human engineers, given a pattern to reverse engineer, behaved the way they always had, not methodically, not patiently, in a furious, competitive, slightly irrational sprint, driven by the particular energy that comes from a problem that absolutely must be solved and cannot wait. The lead engineer on the Shield Countermeasures project was a woman named Caroline Webb, who had not left the design bay in 4 days and communicated primarily through handwritten notes pushed under doors because she found voice communication too slow. She cracked the primary frequency adaptation in 71 hours. It should have taken a month, Patrick told Nina. I know, Nina said. She worked out 2 sub-problems that 3 separate Concorde research bodies have been trying to solve for a decade. I know. Patrick looked at her. You expected this. Nina looked back at him. Grief, she said, is the fastest engine our species has ever produced. I have always known that. I just never wanted to be right about it. 180 of humanity's 220 ships were stripped of their transponders, reduced to minimum power signatures, and sent out under what Nina called the Ghost Fleet Protocol. The routes they took were not the safe routes. They were the routes that ran through unmapped drift zones and unstable relay gaps, passages that other species avoided because the navigation risk was too high. Human pilots took them because the protocol required it, and because every one of them had seen the broadcast, and none of them were in a mood to go the safe way. The remaining 40 ships stayed visible. They responded to Concorde inquiries. They filed routine patrol reports. They were the face that Nina showed to anyone watching. Vorath Sen made a public offer of resettlement terms 2 weeks after the broadcast. He transmitted it on an open channel, galaxy-wide, in the same format as the original declaration. The gesture was deliberate, a display of confidence so absolute it read as contempt. The Vathek expected the math to work on humanity the same way it worked on everyone else. Show an opponent the scale of the gap between you and them, and they will eventually choose survival over pride. Humanity's official response was transmitted the next morning. No text, no demands, no diplomatic language, just an image file, a cycling display of faces. The recorded faces of every person confirmed deceased on Vega Prime, drawn from the colony's identity registry. 1 face per second. At 10.3 billion faces, the cycle would take 326 years to complete. Nina received a private transmission from the Sail delegation 2 days later. The Sail were the oldest continuously spacefaring species in the Concord. 800 years of strict isolationism, no public statements, no votes, no entanglements. Their message was 4 words long. It said, "You are not alone." Nina read it 3 times. Then she filed it in a locked folder and went back to work. She was standing at the navigation table, running the approach vectors for the 19th time, when the tight beam came in from deep space. The signal was barely there, threaded through layers of Vathek relay traffic, disguised as routine maintenance data. Her signals officer almost flagged it as noise. Almost. When it resolved, the voice on the other end was Liam Coles. He sounded tired. He sounded very far away. And he sounded like a man who had found something that he was not yet sure how to describe. "I'm inside their network," he said. "Not physically. Electronically. I rode their own supply traffic in. They use open internal routing between relay nodes, because they never thought anyone would be close enough to exploit it. I've been sitting in their logistics data for 11 days. Admiral, I found something. Their entire broadcast infrastructure. The same system they used to transmit the declaration. The same system they used to air the 11 hours. It runs through a single authenticated master node. 1 node. And the internal encryption is standard grade. They never upgraded it because they've never had an intruder close enough to matter." Nina was very still. "Tell me what you need," she said. "Time," Liam said. "And someone to trigger the access window when I'm ready. I know what I'm going to do with it. But I want to tell you first, so you understand." "Tell me," Nina said. And he did. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "That's not what I expected," she said. "No," he said. "But I think it's the right thing, and I think you know it too." She did not answer immediately. She looked out the viewport at the stars, the same stars that had been there before the broadcast, unchanged, indifferent, going on the way stars always go on. "How long do you need?" she asked. "Give me 3 weeks," he said. "Then watch every open channel." He cut the signal. Nina stood at the viewport for another minute. Then she turned back to the navigation table and began reworking the timing for the Ghost Fleet's final approach. If Liam needed 3 weeks, she would give him exactly 3 weeks. And on the day he moved, she would move too. She pulled up the mission log and added a single note at the top of the file. Initiated. Liam had been alone for 22 days. The station he had built around himself was not a station in any official sense. It was a single-person survival shell, assembled from the stripped components of relay node Kappa 7, folded into the smallest possible power footprint, and tucked into the electromagnetic shadow of a Vathek fuel transit ship that ran a regular route between 2 of their outer system depots. He moved when it moved. He went dark when it docked. He ate the last of his ration bars on day 14, and spent the following 8 days on emergency nutrient packs that tasted like chalk, dissolved in lukewarm water. He did not care. He barely noticed. Because he was inside. Not physically, as he had told Nina, but in every way that mattered. He had threaded himself into the Vathek internal relay network through a gap in their logistics routing that was, by any reasonable measure, not supposed to exist. The Vathek used open internal packet routing between their supply chain nodes because their empire was old and their infrastructure was older, and the systems that ran it had been built in layers over centuries, each new layer added on top of the last, without anyone going back to clean up what was underneath. The result was a network that, at its deep core, still ran on protocols from an era before the Vathek had heard of encryption. It was an enormous, galaxy-spanning empire, built on 6,000 years of unchallenged dominance, and its internal communications were, at the foundational level, about as secure as a postcard. Liam moved through it carefully. He did not take anything. He did not change anything. He watched. He read. He mapped. He built a picture of the Vathek command network so complete that, by day 18, he could have told you the rotation schedule of every fleet unit in the outer sectors, the supply levels of 14 major military depots, and the administrative access credentials for the Empire's primary broadcast authentication node. That last one he had found on day 9. He had stared at it for a long time. The broadcast system that had aired Vega Prime's destruction to the entire galaxy was not a separate military asset. It was tied directly into the Vathek Empire's standard public information network, the same system that carried their internal news, their administrative announcements, their cultural programming. The Grand Admiral had commandeered it for the declaration, the same way a head of government commandeers a public channel for an emergency address. He had plugged in, aired what he wanted the galaxy to see, and plugged out, which meant the system was still there, accessible, and because no one had ever been inside the Vathek network before, the authentication credentials had never been rotated. They were sitting in a logistics admin file, unchanged since the last system update 14 months ago. Liam looked at those credentials for 3 days before he decided what to do with them. The obvious use was a weapon. He could use broadcast access to flood the Vathek military network with false orders. He could transmit misinformation about Earth fleet positions. He could engineer a strategic deception on a scale that no human intelligence operation had ever attempted. He had spent 2 days quietly sketching out what that would look like, because he was thorough, and because he needed to understand every option before he chose one. But the more he thought about it, the more he came back to a different question. Not what damage could he do, but what did the galaxy actually need to see? Because the galaxy had watched 11 hours of the Vega Prime massacre, and then gone mostly quiet. 3 species had made public statements. 40-odd had filed diplomatic complaints through Concord channels. But the broad, terrible truth was that most of the Concord's member civilizations had looked at what the Vathek did and calculated the same math that the Vathek expected every species to calculate. The Vathek were powerful. The humans were not. The massacre was terrible, but it was, from a certain cold distance, manageable. Something that could be mourned without being acted upon. Something that could be filed and moved past. That calculation was possible, Liam realized, because the Concorde had only seen the event from the outside. They had seen the fleet arrive. They had seen the barrage. They had seen the planet fall silent. But they had not seen the 11 hours the way Liam had seen them, from 200,000 kilometers above, with every sensor array he had pointed at the surface, logging not just the weapons impacts but everything else. The communication traffic from the surface. The emergency signals. The public broadcast channels on Vega Prime that had kept transmitting for the first 2 hours, carrying ordinary things, a music program that did not know to stop, a weather update that went out on schedule, a community radio host who kept talking because he did not know what else to do, because talking was the only act of normalcy left to him. Liam had all of it. He also had 200 years of Vathek territorial violations, every instance of a human settlement that had been pressured to relocate, every resource claim that had been quietly invalidated, every treaty clause that had been reinterpreted in the Concorde's legal archives to mean something slightly different from what it had originally said. He had spent 3 days pulling it from the Vathek's own internal historical records, which they kept with meticulous pride, because they considered their legal maneuvering a form of art. He assembled all of it into a single package. Then he added one more thing. At the very end, after the legal records and the sensor data, and the 200 years of documentation, he added 40 minutes of audio from Vega Prime's public broadcast channels during the first 2 hours of the attack. Ordinary voices. A child in a school emergency shelter, singing a song to herself, barely audible. A man on an open channel telling people in the coastal districts to move inland, his voice steady and calm, managing other people's fear before his own. 2 elderly women on a community radio frequency talking to each other in the quiet way of people who have known each other for 50 years and have run out of practical things to say. He did not frame it. He did not explain it. He put it at the end and let it sit there, because some things explain themselves if you give them enough silence around them. At the 3-week mark, he opened a tight beam to Nina's ship. "I'm ready," he said. "So are we," she said. "Go." He accessed the Vathek broadcast authentication node with the credentials he had found in the logistics file. The system accepted them without hesitation. He opened a galaxy-wide mandatory override channel, the same type that Vorath Sen had used for his declaration, and began the upload. The package was large. It took 6 minutes to fully transmit. For 6 hours, the Vathek broadcast network aired humanity's truth to the entire Concord galaxy. The legal record, the sensor data, the voices, all of it. The Vathek's own communication system, which they had used to announce the death of a world, now carried the story of the people who had lived on it. The Grand Admiral's technical teams shut it down after 6 hours. By then it did not matter. The package had been received, copied, and retransmitted by approximately 40 independent relay stations across the Concord, 6 of which belonged to species that had been quietly waiting for a reason to act. Liam logged the shutdown and sat back in his survival shell for the first time in 3 weeks. He was thin. He smelled terrible. His eyes hurt from the screen light and his back had developed a persistent ache from the improvised seat he had built out of equipment cases. He ate the last nutrient pack. Outside his small viewport, the Vathek fuel transit ship he had been shadowing was docking at a depot. He would need to move soon. Before he did, he opened his personal log and recorded a short entry. He did not know if anyone would ever hear it. He recorded it anyway because he had always kept good records, and because it felt important to say it out loud at least once. "They showed the galaxy what they wanted it to see," he said. "I showed it what was true. I don't know yet which one is more powerful, but I know which one I am able to live with." He closed the log. He disconnected from the Vathek network, carefully, leaving no traces. He had already planted one thing before he left, a dormant signal tag, buried in the command network's maintenance layer, invisible to standard scans, waiting for an activation key that only Nina carried. He had placed it not in any weapons system or command relay, but in the Grand Admiral's personal communications interface. A small thing. Quiet. Patient. He maneuvered his shell out of the depot's electromagnetic shadow and began the long journey back through the drift zones. Behind him, across the Concord's vast network, the conversation had already begun. Nina received the Concord's emergency session notice at 06 o'clock. She did not read it immediately. She was standing at the central navigation table with her planning team, making the last adjustments to the Ghost Fleet approach vectors, and she had a rule about not reading administrative messages during final planning windows. At 06:47, she set down her stylus, picked up the notice, and read it. The Concorde had called a full emergency session. Every member species. The subject line of the notice was unprecedented. It did not list a policy item or a territorial dispute. It simply read, "The question of humanity." For 200 years, humanity had appeared before the Concorde as a subject to be managed. This was the first time the phrase suggested something else. Nina put the notice in her pocket and went back to the table. At 09 o'clock on the 24th day since the broadcast, she gave the order. The signal went out on a tight beam to all 180 Ghost Fleet ships, spread across 14 locations deep in Vathek-controlled space. The ships had been holding position for between 8 and 16 days, running cold, waiting. Each ship's captain had received their specific target package before departure. They had spent the waiting period running simulations, checking systems, and doing the very human thing of finding ways to fill silence. The targets were not warships. Nina had spent the first week after the broadcast studying 3,000 years of Vathek military history, and she had found the pattern she was looking for. Every species the Vathek had ever defeated, and there were many, had followed the same sequence. Absorb the initial shock, assess the military gap, attempt a direct confrontation, lose, accept terms. The gap was real. 180 human ships could not defeat 14,000 Vathek warships in direct combat. Nina had no interest in direct combat. What she had was Liam's data. 14 days of Vathek internal logistics records, which told her something that no external analysis ever could. The Vathek Empire's military was enormous, but its operational range depended entirely on a network of 14 critical supply infrastructure nodes, fuel processing stations, drone fabrication platforms, and maintenance depots that had been built centuries ago and never adequately reinforced because no one had ever been close enough to threaten them. She hit all 14 simultaneously. Not with overwhelming force. She could not afford overwhelming force. She hit them with precision. Each Ghost Fleet unit had spent its waiting time calculating the exact strike pattern that would disable the node's operational capacity, without triggering a prolonged defense response. Fast, targeted, and gone before the Vathek could scramble a coordinated reply. The strikes took 11 minutes from first impact to last. Liam's dormant signal tag activated at Nina's command at 0912, 2 minutes into the strike window. It locked Vorath Sen out of his personal communications interface. He could receive incoming signals. He could not send orders. His command staff, trained to await his authorization for any action above tactical unit level, spent 11 minutes watching their screens and waiting for a word that did not come. 11 minutes was, it turned out, exactly long enough. The forward fleet, the 400 ships that had destroyed Vega Prime, repositioned since then into a defensive formation around the Empire's inner systems, received no coordinated orders during the strike window. Individual unit commanders made individual decisions. Some moved to intercept, some held position, some requested instructions and received nothing. The formation broke along its own command seams. What happened next was not a victory in the conventional sense. It was a sustained, grinding, 7-hour engagement between the Ghost Fleet's 180 ships and the fragments of a 400-ship fleet that could not agree on what it was supposed to be doing. Human pilots flew patterns that the Vathek tactical systems flagged repeatedly as non-optimal, because the patterns accepted higher individual ship risk in exchange for collective positional advantage, and the Vathek models were calibrated to opponents who prioritized survival. Caroline Webb's countermeasures handled 60% of the Vathek weapons frequencies. The remaining 40% hit. Nina lost 40 ships. She had expected to lose 60. At hour 7, the Vathek forward fleet's remaining units withdrew. Not in formation, in groups, pulling back toward the inner systems. No coordinated retreat order had been issued. They left because the individual unit commanders had run their own calculations and reached their own conclusions. Nina stood at the viewport for a long moment after the last Vathek signal disappeared from the scan array. Patrick came to stand beside her. He was quiet for a minute. 40 ships, he said. Yes, she said. 1,120 people. Yes. Another silence. The Concord session starts in 4 hours, Patrick said. I know. Nina did not look away from the stars. Send Vorath Sen a message before I go. Private channel. No diplomatic framing. Just text. What should it say? She thought about the broadcast. She thought about 11 hours. She thought about Owen the farmer and the community radio host who kept talking because he did not know what else to do. She thought about 40 ships and 1,120 names she would need to learn before she slept. Tell him, she said. Now you know what it felt like. Patrick wrote it down. He went to send it. Nina straightened her collar, picked up the Concord session notice from her pocket, and began preparing to walk into a room where, for the first time in human history, her species was not the smallest thing at the table. Liam had never been inside the Concord Grand Assembly before. He had seen images of it, the way most people had, architectural photographs in school materials, the occasional broadcast of a major vote, the stylized illustrations in political history texts. Nothing in any of those had prepared him for the scale of it. The chamber was carved from the interior of an asteroid that had been hollowed out over 4 centuries, and gradually fitted with the infrastructure of a civilization's most important room. The seating tiers rose in a wide curve, 140 sections, each one fitted for the biology of a different species. The floor was a single piece of pale stone, unmarked except for the speaker's position at the center. A plain circle 2 meters across, with nothing in it except the expectation that you would fill it with something worth hearing. Liam walked to the center and stopped. He was wearing clean clothes. Someone on Nina's ship had found him a set in approximately his size. He had managed a shower and something approaching a decent sleep during the transit, though the nutrient-packed diet of the past several weeks had left him thinner than he had ever been. and his hands still had the faint tremor that he had noticed during his last few days inside the Vathek network, the kind that comes from sustained intensity that the body has not quite released yet. He looked at the tiers, 140 species. Some he recognized from images. Most he did not. They were all looking at him. He had been chosen by Earth's emergency government because he had been there at the beginning, because he had watched the 11 hours and recorded them, because he had gone back into the Vathek network alone and found a way to do something with the truth. These were the reasons the government had given. Liam suspected there was a simpler reason underneath them all. He was not a politician. He was not a general. He was not carrying anyone's agenda into this room except his own. He had written his statement himself. He had written it in the same way he wrote everything, carefully, with attention to what each word actually meant, without extra weight. He did not spend much time on what the Vathek had done. Everyone in the room had seen the broadcast. Everyone had now seen his own transmission, the legal records, the sensor data, the voices. He did not need to re-argue the evidence. It was in the room already. It was in every delegate who had sat through 40 minutes of audio from a world in its last hours and heard two elderly women talking to each other in the quiet way of people who have run out of practical things to say. Instead, he spent most of his statement talking about what he was laying on the floor of this chamber. Not a demand for revenge, not a claim for territory or reparations, a document. The Articles of Galactic Accountability. It was not a long document. He had written it in plain language on purpose, because he had spent enough time in communications to know that complexity is where important things go to die. It contained 4 provisions. First, any deliberate military action against a sapient civilian population would be classified as a crime against the Concord, regardless of the legal framework used to justify it. Second, no legal mechanism, including the Planetary Usage Charter, the Environmental Review Protocol, or any equivalent instrument, could be used to authorize such an action. Third, any species that carried out such an action would be subject to immediate mandatory tribunal, convened from member species with no prior military or treaty involvement. Fourth, any member species that witnessed such an action and took no action to prevent or respond to it would be subject to a formal review of their Concord standing. The fourth provision was the one that made the chamber uncomfortable. Liam had written it on purpose. He finished speaking. He stepped back. He waited. The Sale delegate rose first. The Sale were tall and very still, the way things are still when they have decided to be still on purpose. Their delegate had not spoken in any recorded Concord session in 800 years. When she opened her mouth, the chamber went so quiet that Liam could hear the ventilation system cycling in the walls. "We second the motion," she said. 41 species voted to support the articles within the hour. The remaining 99 were not opposed. Most were calculating. It is the nature of political bodies that a certain number of their members will wait to see which direction the majority is moving before they commit. By the end of the session's first day, the voting total stood at 87 in favor, none opposed, and 53 abstaining. The abstentions would continue to drop over the following week, as the arithmetic of the situation became undeniable. The Vathek Grand Admiral was taken into Concord custody at 14 o'clock, on the third day of the session, by a joint security team drawn from 4 species. He did not resist. His empire's logistical collapse, triggered by the simultaneous loss of 14 critical infrastructure nodes, had spent the previous week moving faster than his administration could respond to. Trade routes were suspended by 8 Concord members. Supply agreements were frozen. 3 species that had previously depended on Vathek military protection for border security quietly opened independent negotiations with neighboring systems. An empire built on the assumption of absolute dominance had discovered, in the space of 1 month, that absolute dominance has no contingency plan for the moment it stops being absolute. Vorath Sen was held in a simple room. Every day, for the duration of his tribunal, which lasted 4 years, he was required to sit and listen to the full 11-hour broadcast, not as punishment in any physical sense, as a condition of the proceeding. The tribunal's reasoning, written in formal language that Liam later read 3 times, stated that any judgment rendered without full understanding of the act under review was not a judgment but an abstraction, and that the accused should carry the complete weight of what he had authorized before he could be held meaningfully accountable for it. Liam found the reasoning fair. The Vathek Empire did not collapse entirely. What it did was contract, slowly, painfully, over a period of years, into something smaller and more inward-looking, stripped of its military capacity and most of its territorial holdings, watched closely by a Concord that had, for the first time, agreed on a framework for watching. They were not occupied. They were not destroyed. They were left to live with what they had done, and with who they had been when they did it. Humanity did not take their space. The newly ratified Articles of Galactic Accountability forbade the kind of territorial annexation that the Vathek had used as a model. Instead, new human colonies were established, slowly, carefully, on worlds that were chosen and documented and filed with the Concord in full compliance with the revised Planetary Usage Charter, which had been rewritten from scratch by a committee that included, at humanity's insistence, 2 species that had previously lost territory to Vathek legal maneuvering. The first new colony was named Vega Remembered. The second was named for Caroline Webb, who had not technically done anything that the naming committee could point to as heroic, but who had spent 4 sleepless days solving problems that should have taken a month, and whom the committee felt deserved something. The third new colony was named Merrick's Folly. This was because Liam had once described his plan to infiltrate the Vathek network as probably a foolish idea that I am going to attempt anyway, in a personal log that was accidentally included in a data package transmitted to Earthfleet Command, copied to the Concord record, and somehow leaked to about 40 news services across the human network. He had not been embarrassed by the name when it was announced. He thought it was accurate. He was sitting in the observation deck of the Concord's residential station when Nina found him. It was late by station time. Most of the corridors were quiet. She came and sat in the chair beside him and looked out at the same stars that he was looking at. They had been doing a lot of this lately, being in the same place and not saying much, because there was a particular kind of understanding between people who had been through the same thing from different angles, and sometimes that understanding is most honestly expressed in shared silence. After a while, Nina said, "Was it worth it?" Liam did not answer immediately. He thought about 10.3 billion faces cycling on an open channel. He thought about 40 ships and 1,120 names. He thought about Owen the farmer and his irrigation system. He thought about 2 elderly women talking to each other in the last hours of their world. He thought about a single Sael delegate, rising from 800 years of silence to say 2 words that changed the count in a room. He thought about the Articles of Galactic Accountability, sitting now in the Concord's permanent legal record, 4 plain provisions in simple language, which he had written himself on a scratched console in a survival shell that smelled like chalk and recycled air. He thought about the word that Nina had written at the top of her mission log. "Ask me again in 100 years, he said. "I think the answer is still being written." Nina nodded. She looked at the stars. He looked at the stars. Outside the viewport, 326 years of faces were still cycling on humanity's open channel. The count had not stopped. It would not stop. Not because humanity needed to hold on to the grief, but because 10.3 billion people deserved to be seen, and the galaxy had agreed, finally, to look. Somewhere out in the dark, the first survey team for the 4th new colony was already running its scans, filing its documentation, doing everything correctly and carefully, and in full compliance with the new rules that a dead world had made necessary. The stars did not change. They never do. They go on the way stars always go on, indifferent and vast and permanent, while the small, strange, stubborn things that live in the light between them keep deciding, over and over, what kind of story they are going to tell. Humanity had decided. The answer was still being written, and this time, the galaxy was listening.